Hello Year 10, welcome to this video tutorial on Macbeth Act 1 Scene 5. In this tutorial we're going to work through the scene fairly steadily, and there will be some questions along the way for you to respond to think about what Shakespeare's really up to in this scene. You can also use this tutorial alongside the Act 1 Scene 5 analysis frame that will be sent to you via Frog, and that sheet is just quite a useful way of pulling all your ideas into one place so that the scene is easier to revise in the future. It's been a while since we've had a look at Macbeth, so I thought it would be a good idea to start with a bit of a recap of the story so far. If you remember, Act 1 Scene 1 shows us the witches for the first time planning to meet with Macbeth and make some mischief and cause a bit of chaos in his life. Act 1 Scene 2 is a scene where there's an injured sergeant who's been brought off the battlefield, and he's updating Duncan on how the battle has been going, and he tells Duncan that Macbeth and Banquo have stood out amongst the soldiers, having worked together to secure victory in the battle against the King of Norway. Now in this scene we also hear about the Thane of Cawdor, who has been captured and has confessed to treachery. He's been working alongside the King of Norway to bring down King Duncan, and because he's confessed to his crimes, it's decided that he needs to be punished and plans are made for his execution. Being a wise king, Duncan knows that he needs to reward those that have been loyal, and so sends some messengers to Macbeth to tell him that he is now the Thane of Cawdor, that the former Thane of Cawdor has been executed, and Macbeth has won that title by being loyal and serving the king faithfully. Now meanwhile, back on the battlefield, Macbeth and Banquo have encountered three witches who have given them some prophecies about the future. Now Macbeth is told by the witches that he is going to become Thane of Cawdor and will be king at some point in the future, and Banquo is told that even though he himself won't be king, his children will be. And just as the witches disappear and vanish into the air, the messengers arrive with news from Duncan. Macbeth and Banquo are really shocked to discover that the first prophecy has come true. What might that mean for the rest of the prophecies? In Act 1 Scene 4, Macbeth and Duncan meet face to face for the first time, and Duncan is really warm and affectionate towards Macbeth, but we've already seen that Macbeth has started thinking about the prospect of murdering Duncan, and so he's a lot more awkward with Duncan. As part of this conversation, Duncan tells Macbeth that as a special honour he's going to visit Macbeth's castle, Dunsinane, and this lets Macbeth know that he suddenly got an opportunity to carry out the murder if he decides to go that way, and so he sends Lady Macbeth a letter to tell her the news and makes a sharp exit and rushes home to make some plans. So there are some important things that we need to note about the first four scenes before we move on. The first is that Macbeth is already thinking about murdering Duncan. He says, "Why do I yield to that suggestion whose horrid image doth unfix my hair and make my seated heart knock at my ribs against the use of nature?" And actually in the next couple of lines he uses the word murder. The second thing to note is that Banquo clearly does not trust the witches. He says that the instruments of darkness tell us truths, win us with honest trifles to betray us in deepest consequence, and he warns Macbeth that this may all be a trick. Thirdly, we need to remember that Macbeth doesn't know that Duncan is coming to stay when he sends the letter to Lady Macbeth. So when she's reading the letter at the beginning of Act 1 Scene 5, she hasn't any idea that Duncan is on his way. We also need to keep in mind that Macbeth needs 3 things in place in order to carry out the murder of Duncan, and Duncan's visit provides him with his opportunity. The moment he hears that Duncan is coming to visit, Macbeth says, "Stars, hide your fires, let not light see my black and deep desires." And that tells us that he knows that Duncan's visit will be the moment he needs. We know that Macbeth already has the means to kill Duncan. He's a really skilled soldier, and if you remember back in Act 1 Scene 2, the sergeant gives a description of Macbeth's actions on the battlefield. He says that Macbeth's sword smoked with bloody execution, and so we've already been told that Macbeth is quite familiar with violence. Macbeth also needs a motive, and in Act 1 Scene 4, Duncan officially makes Malcolm, his son, the Prince of Cumberland, and that means that he is now officially the next in line to the throne. And Macbeth's response to this is to say, "Prince of Cumberland, that is a step on which I must fall down or else o'erleap, for in my way it lies." He knows that with Duncan's announcement, there is no way that he is going to become king in a natural way, and so he knows that he now needs to take matters into his own hands if he is ever going to wear the crown. Okay, let's get into the scene then. So Act 1 Scene 5 is the first time we meet Lady Macbeth, and unlike other characters, no one's really talked about her up until this point, and so this is our first real meeting with this very unusual woman. The scene is set at Dunsinane Castle, that's where Macbeth lives, but we know he's not home yet. Lady Macbeth is there on her own, and that means that she can be very honest about her thoughts and feelings because there's no one there to overhear her or see what she's doing. The question we need to keep with us as we read is, what does Shakespeare want us to think about Lady Macbeth? As with all character introductions, there are going to be some particular things that Shakespeare wants us to notice, and we're going to observe those as we go along. It would be a good idea at this point to pause the video and read Act 1 Scene 5. You should have been sent a digital copy on Frog, and if you haven't got that, then just Google Macbeth Act 1 Scene 5. There are literally hundreds of sites where you can get a copy of the text. Let's have a look at this first section of the scene. What we've got on the screen here is the section where Lady Macbeth is reading the letter that Macbeth has sent her. And the first thing to note here is that it's written in prose. Now, prose is spoken or written language in its ordinary form. There's no rhyme here, there's no rhythm, there's nothing that makes it sound like poetry. And this is quite unusual because Shakespeare would normally have a noble character like Macbeth or Lady Macbeth speaking in verse with some sort of rhythm or poetry to their language. And the reason it's not here is that this is just simple delivery of information. Macbeth is just telling her the facts. When we see her start to respond to this information, we're going to see her language change quite dramatically. The first thing we see in this scene is a stage direction, and we're told that Lady Macbeth comes into the scene reading a letter, and we need to think about what the audience of 1606, when this play was first performed, would think about this. Now, we know from our study of witchcraft at this point in history that women who could read were treated with great suspicion because reading gave them some independence and enabled them to think for themselves. And so Shakespeare's doing something very particular here by introducing us to Lady Macbeth in this way. It's also interesting that we join Lady Macbeth part way through the letter, just at the moment where she's reading Macbeth's account of his meeting with the witches. So the very first thing Lady Macbeth is speaking about in this play is witchcraft, and Macbeth tells her that the witches have more in them than mortal knowledge, and that shows us that he believes the witches are getting their information from a supernatural source. Now, it was believed that witches had creatures with them called familiars who took the form of animals but were sort of go-betweens between witches and the devil. And so Macbeth clearly believes that these witches have special insight and knowledge. It's clear that he trusts them and believes them. Macbeth's belief in the witches can also be seen in the way he describes their behaviour. He says that they made themselves air into which they vanished, and so the suggestion here is that they just disappeared magically. And there's quite a lot of bias in this description. There's no suggestion here that Macbeth thinks that there might be a rational explanation for their disappearance. He immediately leaps on the fact that they have special powers, because this reinforces his belief that they can see into the future. Macbeth clearly finds these witches really impressive. Words like rapt and wonder suggest that he found the whole experience completely amazing. And there's a suggestion here that Shakespeare wants us to think that Macbeth is under the witch's spell in some way, that he's been bewitched. Now, we need to ask ourselves whether or not that is actually the case. Is Macbeth in the power of the witches, or is he acting on his own? We can ask ourselves whether Macbeth would be behaving in this way if the prophecies had been bad. Had the witches suggested that his future was going to be full of misery, I wonder whether Macbeth would be so keen to write home and tell his wife about them. And so while on one hand Shakespeare's suggesting that the witches have got some influence over Macbeth, he's also revealing that maybe it's ambition at work here, that Macbeth is believing what he wants to believe. He's so convinced by the witches because they've promised him greatness in his future. We see something quite unusual next. Macbeth refers to Lady Macbeth as his dearest partner of greatness. Look at the respectful way he talks about her. This was really unusual at the time. And the word partner is particularly surprising because it suggests that Macbeth sees his wife as an equal, and this would have been really quite shocking at this point in history. We can also see this at the end of the letter. Macbeth says that he's written that she might not lose the dues of rejoicing by being ignorant of what greatness is promised thee. Now notice that he uses the word thee here. The promise is for Lady Macbeth, even though she wasn't mentioned in the witches' prophecies. It's clear here that Macbeth sees his success and his glory as Lady Macbeth's success and Lady Macbeth's glory, and there's a willingness here to share the prophecies, that he sees her as his partner, as his ally, as his equal. And so there's this willingness to share. It's clear that at this point in the play their relationship is quite strong and quite close, and he's got an awful lot of respect for her. He wants to write so that she can get excited about the good that's coming their way. Now, after the murder of Duncan, we're going to see this relationship start to break apart and disintegrate because of the effects of what they've done. But it's really important that at this very early stage we see the closeness of their partnership. Okay, so here's your first task. What does the letter tell us about the relationship between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth? And this is where you can write a more extended answer. Have a think about the way that language is used in particular, and try in your response to use quotations and refer specifically to the choices that Shakespeare has made to communicate something about the relationship between Macbeth and his wife. Okay, so the next section of the scene is where Lady Macbeth starts saying her own words because she's responding to the information that she's read in that letter. And you should be able to see that immediately the language has changed. This is no longer prose, now she is speaking in verse. And she begins by giving her initial reactions to the news that Macbeth has shared with her, and her first thoughts are about the character of her husband and whether or not he's going to be able to do what's necessary to get hold of that crown. Like her husband, Lady Macbeth also immediately believes the witches. Look how definite her language is. She says that Macbeth shalt be what he's promised, and the words shalt and promised are very determined, they're very definite, and suggest that this is almost their destiny. We could also ask the same question of Lady Macbeth: is she bewitched? Or is she also ambitious? These prophecies are exactly what she wants to hear, and so she has no hesitation in throwing her belief behind them immediately. She then begins to assess Macbeth's character, and she uses a metaphor to do this. She says that he is too full of the milk of human kindness to catch the nearest way. Now, what she means by this is that Macbeth's nature is too gentle, and all the way through this play, Shakespeare is going to play with gender stereotypes, and milk is associated with a maternal instinct. It's suggestive of femininity, as in mother's milk, and kindness and holiness and purity and lack of ruthlessness, all the things that she goes on to say Macbeth is, they are all stereotypically feminine qualities, and so she's basically suggesting that Macbeth lacks the masculinity and the manliness to do what's necessary. Now, Lady Macbeth is in no doubt that her husband is an ambitious man. She says that he would highly like to be king and that he would strongly win. That means that he wants things that he's not really entitled to. But she says that he wants to do it holily and without being dishonest or cheating in any way. And so this is where our theme of ambition starts to be developed in the play. She claims that he lacks the necessary qualities that ambition requires, that if you want to be ambitious, if you want to be great, you have to be willing to play dirty. And she doubts that Macbeth is able to do this. Now, a good question to ask here is she right? The first time we see Macbeth, he is being spoken about as somebody that is completely ruthless in battle, that is willing to face down any enemy and do anything that's necessary in order to win. And so we've got to ask some questions about whether Lady Macbeth knows her husband very well or not. Perhaps actually it's the sergeant that doesn't know Macbeth well. Perhaps Lady Macbeth knows him better than anyone. Only time will tell. Lady Macbeth is quite excited about the prospect of Macbeth becoming king, and she almost wills him to come home quickly. She says, "Hie thee hither." And the reason she gives is that I may pour my spirit in thine ear. Now, this is another metaphor, and the implication here is almost that of witchcraft. So it's like she wants to pour a potion into his ear, and so there's another link there between Lady Macbeth and witchcraft. And she's playing around again with these stereotypes, these masculine and feminine stereotypes, and she's claiming that she has more masculine qualities than Macbeth. She has ruthlessness and bravery and power and the ability to strategize, and she's going to fill Macbeth's ears by speaking to him. She's got skill with words, clearly. She's an educated woman, she's articulate, and she's got powers of persuasion that she wants to use on Macbeth to make sure he is willing to go through with whatever is necessary. Okay, so task 2, I want you to think about that section we've just looked at and answer the question, how does Shakespeare use language to reverse the roles of Macbeth and Lady Macbeth in this part of the scene? And again, I want you to make reference to the language choices Shakespeare's made, and I've deliberately not picked out every tiny detail that you could talk about, so see if you can find anything that I haven't talked you through and include that in your response. Okay, let's move on to the next section. Now, the section that you've got on the screen now is the part where a messenger arrives and interrupts Lady Macbeth to tell her that Duncan is coming to stay. And look at her shock when she hears this news. She says, "Thou art mad to say it." And we see a really interesting parallel here between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, because like her husband, she has immediately seen that this presents an opportunity for them to work together, kill Duncan and get the crown for Macbeth. Lady Macbeth assumes that the messenger must be mistaken because she's convinced that Macbeth would have sent somebody ahead of him to allow her time to prepare for the arrival of Duncan, but the messenger confirms that he has actually done this. But the servant that's arrived from Macbeth is almost dead for breath. Now that means that Macbeth is travelling so fast to get home to plot with Lady Macbeth that it's nearly killed his servant to arrive there before him. It shows the urgency that Macbeth is travelling with. Now this is where we see another parallel between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, because her language changes very dramatically here, and it becomes very similar to the way that Macbeth spoke when he heard that Duncan was going to visit his house. If you remember, he appeals to darkness to cover up everything he's going to do, and Lady Macbeth does something very similar in this next section. Now the first parallel we see is that her first thought is of murder. Remember, nobody has put this idea in her mind, but she says that Duncan's entrance to Dunsinane will be fatal, and so it shows us that, like Macbeth, her first thought is to the quickest route to the crown, and that is murdering the king. Her language here is really interesting. Her speech in this section, it's a soliloquy, and it sounds very much like a spell or an incantation. There are quite a lot of overlaps with the witches, so although the rhythm and the rhyme is not the same, her references and her imagery is very similar to what we've heard from them. Lady Macbeth here speaks in blank verse. Now blank verse is when iambic pentameter is used but without rhyme, and Shakespeare often uses this style of language for important or noble characters, but here it also gives pace and energy to the section. Lady Macbeth is working towards Duncan's arrival and thinking about all that that means, and it's clear that she's quite excited and animated about what's about to happen. Lady Macbeth says, "Unsex me here," and she's appealing to the spirits, the dark spirits at work in the world, and this is where Shakespeare starts playing with those gender stereotypes again that we were talking about earlier. Now what Lady Macbeth means here is that she wants to be defeminised. She's hoping that some force will be at work that will push down all of those feminine qualities that might make her back out and make her more masculine in her behaviour and her way of thinking, so that she can do whatever's necessary. There's something very interesting in the next few lines, and we're going to have to dig into the context a little bit to really understand what Lady Macbeth is saying. She says, "Make thick my blood," and a few lines later she says, "Take my milk for gall." Now, at the time this play was written, there was a belief in something called the four humours, and these were four substances that were present in the body that needed to be kept in balance in order to keep a healthy body and mind. And these four substances were blood, phlegm, black bile and yellow bile, which is also known as gall. And each of these four substances were connected with personality types, and The two that she references here are really interesting. So blood, that she mentions first, is associated with leadership and stability. And so what she's wanting here is for her leadership skills and her stability to become thickened, to become more substantial, more dominant in her, so that she's able to do whatever it takes to become the queen. The second one she mentions, Gaul, is associated with passion and aggression and ambition. So again, here she's asking to become more aggressive and powerful and ambitious, so that she doesn't back out. And so this is Lady Macbeth willing her body to go out of balance in order to make her more capable of doing the most ruthless deeds that she's going to need to do. It's also worth remembering that she claimed that Macbeth was too full of the milk of human kindness, and so she associates milk, that maternal nurturing mother's milk, as being something that makes you weak, and she doesn't want that. So she wants her maternal instinct, her instinct to nurture, which is stereotypically feminine, to be suppressed, and these more masculine qualities to come to the fore, make her more powerful and strong than her husband. We said earlier that Lady Macbeth's language becomes more poetic when she's saying her own words, and we've already noticed that she's speaking in blank verse here. Look at the imagery that's packed into this section. It makes it very beautiful. It's quite dark, but it is very beautiful language, and there's a sort of semantic field of words associated with darkness here. So we've got things like night, raven, spirit, sightless, thick night, dunnest smoke. It's worth noting that a raven was often seen as an omen, a sign that something bad was about to happen. But she's got all of this imagery associated with darkness, and Shakespeare is making the connection here between darkness and evil, that bad things happen in the dark, and we've already seen both the witches and Macbeth make similar references. I want to also note the metaphor towards the end of this section. She talks about the blanket of the dark, and there's a suggestion here in that metaphor that darkness will offer Lady Macbeth some sort of comfort, that it will hide her deeds and keep her safe. And so we've got Shakespeare suggesting that she is more at home in darkness than in light, that she might be at heart quite an evil character. Okay, another task then. So the first two questions linked together. I want you to think about the language that Shakespeare has used in this first presentation of Lady Macbeth, and I want you to think about how the way she speaks is similar to the witches and how is it different. So what we're looking at is how Shakespeare is making her one with the witches and how he's keeping her separate. And secondly, I want you to think about what Shakespeare is wanting us to think about her at this point. So that's going to need a little bit more thought, and you can pause the video here if you want to again and respond to that question. Okay, we're in the last part of the scene now, and at this point Macbeth arrives, and this is the first time we're going to get to see these two characters interact and be together. Now notice how Lady Macbeth greets her husband. She says, "Great Glamis, worthy Cawdor," and this is very similar to the way that he addressed her in the letter when he said, "My dearest partner of greatness." What we're seeing is their mutual respect here and the closeness of their relationship. The first thing that she does after that initial greeting is to express her confidence that Macbeth is going to be king very soon. She says that he will be greater than both of these titles that he already has, and she says that his letters have transported me beyond this ignorant present, and I feel now the future in the instant. She believes that the time is now. There is an opportunity to grab the crown, and she knows that it's going to happen quite quickly. And so what we see here is how excited she is about that possibility. She's also suggesting that the witch's prophecies have almost brought the future forward. She can almost sense it and feel it and taste it because of the prophecies that the witches have given. They've made that future possibility of Macbeth being king and her being queen almost a reality in the present. It's almost like the crown is already on Macbeth's head. They just have to make it happen. Lady Macbeth obviously feels confident in Macbeth and their relationship, because when Macbeth tells her that Duncan is only going to stay for one night, her response is, "Oh, never shall sun that morrow see." She's basically saying to Macbeth that Duncan is not going to wake up tomorrow morning after he slept in their castle. And so she's basically telling Macbeth that they're going to kill him. And that's quite a bold thing to say when they haven't really discussed it. Remember, she's only read a letter and they haven't had any sort of conversation. And she goes straight in with, "We're going to kill him tonight." And he doesn't respond immediately. It's clear that it's not a shocking, appalling suggestion from her. He is quite happy to let her carry on and complete the thought. Now, what might be more shocking to Macbeth is the way that she describes his character in the next few lines. She uses a sequence of metaphors to suggest to Macbeth that he doesn't really have what it takes. Now, the first one almost could be heard as a compliment. She says, "Your face, my thane, is as a book where men may read strange matters." And so she's basically saying that Macbeth is very easy to read, and she's maybe suggesting that she's concerned that he's going to give the game away. She follows this up by giving Macbeth a little bit of advice, and she uses another metaphor to do this. And this is a quote definitely worth learning off by heart. She says, "Look like the innocent flower, but be the serpent under it." She's basically making a reference to the serpent in the Garden of Eden, the devil here. So she's telling Macbeth that he needs to look innocent, look appealing and totally normal and inoffensive, but underneath the surface of that, he should be like the devil, like a serpent, a hidden snake, ready to pounce. Look how dominant Lady Macbeth is here. Macbeth barely speaks. Remember that he's just come home after a long time away, and she almost never stops talking. He has hardly any lines here. Now, considering at this time in history, men were considered to be the heads of the household. They were the dominant force in the household. Here we see roles reversed a little bit, and again Shakespeare is playing with those gender roles. Lady Macbeth takes control and dominates this conversation, and Macbeth is left with very little to say. Now, it's worth thinking about why Shakespeare might choose to do this. What does it suggest about Lady Macbeth, and why do you think Macbeth doesn't say a lot here? There might be a whole range of possibilities and explanations for these choices. Definitely worth thinking about. Lady Macbeth gets the last line in the scene, which is another way that Shakespeare is showing us how much control she's got at this point in the play. And that last line reads, "Leave all the rest to me." This is Lady Macbeth completely taking charge of the murder of Duncan and coming up with a plan and making all the arrangements. And she's basically telling her husband not to worry about it. We need to keep in mind, though, that Macbeth is a trained soldier, and we saw in Act 1, Scene 2 descriptions of him being able to make very quick decisions, spot what's most important and go straight to it. He's a very capable man, and so Lady Macbeth is carrying on this suggestion that she is actually far more capable out of the two of them, that she doesn't believe that Macbeth's up to the job. Now, we know different, and so we're back to that question again about whose assessment of Macbeth is the most accurate. It's this question that I want you to think about for the last response task of this scene. Is Lady Macbeth's assessment of Macbeth accurate or fair, and I want you to build in some reasons for what you think. And secondly, I want you to think about the significance of the way Shakespeare has introduced Lady Macbeth to the audience in this scene. You can go and respond to that question in a moment, but I just want to thank you for listening. This is the end of the tutorial. I hope it's been a helpful journey through Act 1 Scene 5, and if you haven't been stopping along the way, please do complete those tasks. They will be available to you on Frog so that you can get some feedback on your responses. It's also worth looking at that analysis frame that I mentioned right at the beginning, because it will help you to pull your thoughts together and give you a really useful revision resource for the future. So I hope this has been helpful. I hope that you've learned something along the way, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.